Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about Zhuangzi, one of the most influential philosophers of the Taoist tradition. And as I said in the video on Martin Luther King, if you have looked at that already, presents a kind of contrasting picture about what we should do about our human nature in order to live satisfying lives. So we're going to talk a little bit about Taoism, a little bit of some of the overarching perspectives, tying it to Zhuangzi, and then we're going to talk specifically about what I had you read. So, Taoism, or it also be called Taoism with the T, depends on what version you're looking at, what text, is a philosophy that emerged during the Warring States period, which also is when Confucianism emerged. It's considered to be one of the most fruitful periods of Chinese history, where lots of people are trying to figure out how do we live well together? How do we do all the things that we need to do? Because there's so much conflict, right? And so the Taoist philosophers have a very different, literally opposing view to the Confucians, in that they believe that a lot of what the Confucians call Ren, humaneness or benevolence, is actually what hinders human beings from being what we're supposed to be, from doing what we're supposed to do, rather than helping us actualize our potential. All of the rituals and customs and desires and wants, the trappings of human society are all just things that we picked up when we lost our true sense of self. So for many Taoists, the ultimate goal is to live in alignment with the Tao. And Tao is translated literally as the way. And as you'll see in English, we'll say a way of life, right? Which is probably the closest way you can translate it, right? But in Taoism, the reason why it's called Tao is that there is the idea there's a way, as in the way things are, what ultimately is. And you'll see lots of contradictory descriptions of the Tao because that's the point. It's not something that you can understand with your rational thought. It's something that you can perceive and live in alignment with. You can notice it, but it's not something you're going to have a perfect vision of because it, by definition, eludes all definition, right? It's kind of a nice contradictory phrase, right? So the Tao is that which it began, but also has no, but also is eternal. Is that which ends, right? But also keeps going, right? They say that it's big and it's small. It's everything at once because it's the thing that our descriptions can attach to. So when we point to reality and we say, oh, this thing lasts forever. Well, in that same reality also exist things which end. So you can't actually point to one and say that one is more of what reality is than the other, right? The classic symbol of Taoism is the yin yang, which, if you can envision it, right, it's got black and white, and it's got a white dot in the black and a black dot in the white, and that symbolizes how there are ways to understand different opposites like light and dark, but light is in dark and dark is in light because everything mutually defines each other. You can't understand eternity without things ending. And you can't understand things ending without some notion that things go on. It's not saying it's eternity, but it's things continue. You can't really understand hot without cold. You can't really understand happiness without sadness, and vice versa. All the things are ultimately bound to each other, right? All meanings that we make reference other things that are meaningful, right? But all of this, what I'm talking about definitions and opposites and things like that, is still conceptual. Because ultimately, when you go out to nature, things are just happening. The clouds are just moving, water is just falling from the sky, the sun is still, and the earth revolves around it. There's no real thought or intention behind it. There's just something that's continually happening, continually arising. And the Taoists argue that if we live in alignment with that, everything will happen the way it's supposed to happen. So Taoism is a very broad ranging tradition with lots of different perspectives. And probably the most influential is actually not Taoism in itself, but the fusion with Buddhism called Chan. Right? Buddhism comes from India, it gets into China, it overlaps a lot with Taoism, and so the two fuse together into a uniquely Chinese vision of Buddhism, which then goes off to Japan and becomes Zen, which you may have heard of Zen Buddhism. And Zen Buddhism comes to the United States, which is our primary, in the United States, our primary contact with Buddhism. Now there's other traditions that have come over as well, like Theravada and things like that. But Zen was the first one to really catch on. And so the ultimate ideal is a couple things. One is the idea of something called equanimity. Equanimity meaning all things being equal to you. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that whether things are bad or good, it doesn't disturb you because you understand that whatever you consider bad or good is just a judgment. The Taoists spend a lot of time talking about how our own judgments limit our freedom, right? And the Taoists want ultimate freedom. For me to say this is bad means I'm going to avoid it at all costs, or I'm going to feel bad if that happens. If for me to say something's good means I'm going to seek it, right? And then feel good only when those things happen. But our judgments limit ourselves so much because ultimately what we are is the same thing as whatever is in the entire cosmos. The entire thing that exists, the ultimate foundation of that, we also are in that as well. So, what's more free? To be able to act as an individual person in relation to others, or to be able to meld into this magnificent thing that's ongoing and unfolding around us at all times? And this is why when we look at the true man in 6:1, but also something in 6:2, it talks about how the ideal person, which was how we would, we could talk about it now, isn't really, like I said, they think that dying early is good and that living old is good. They think that being hot is good, being cold is good. They sleep without dreams, right? And they wake up, they don't have anxiety, right? The idea is when you let everything go, when you let all of your expectations go, you find equanimity, which is a form of peace, a form of tranquility, which is one of the ultimate goals of Taoism. The Taoists will often say, think about how much of our suffering is caused by our own expectations. We believe, and as Taoists, often with very little evidence, that certain things shouldn't happen to us or should. We have expectations that the people that we love shouldn't die. Well, it's that they shouldn't die, or that we should be able to find love in the world, or feel satisfied and not be in poverty, and be able to eat whenever we want and grow food and there not be famines and not get diseases and all these things, that we have great friends. But these are all expectations. When you look into the world, these kind of things don't happen all the time. Lots of people die. People die every day. People get lonely every day. Millions of people live in poverty, right? Lots of people suffer. But what you can do for your full freedom is to understand that whatever happens, happens. It's not a matter of you being upset about it and trying to change it or things like that, but to accept that whatever situation you're in is a natural way that things are meant to be, right? And so there's a story that goes along with this. I'll tell it briefly, but there is a monk who is living in a village. And in this village, there's a young girl who falls in love with the guy that she's not supposed to be with. Her family doesn't like him. He's the wrong class and all those things like that, right? And she decides to still be with this guy and they fall in love and this is all secret, but she ends up pregnant. She freaks out. She's like, oh my God, now everything's going to be exposed, right? So she says, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll blame it on the monk. So she tells her family, yeah, the monk, he seduced me. He got me, and now I'm pregnant. And I'm like, oh my, so ashamed. So the community is obviously outraged. So they rush to the monk and they say, how could you have done this to this poor girl? You violated your duties. You violated our trust. Like, you're a horrible person. And the monk's response is, oh, is that so? Okay. And he keeps doing what he's doing. So then, months later, the baby's born. The family comes and they say, hey, this is your responsibility. You're the one that got her pregnant. You take care of this baby. So here, take it. And the monk says, oh, is that so? Okay. He starts taking care of the baby. Then months later, the girl sees that, she's seen the baby, she feels guilty, she, tarnishes Monk's character, she feels like she misses her child, she wants to be with her baby. So finally she breaks down and confesses and says, hey, I actually was being with somebody I wasn't supposed to be with. It's totally the monk's fault. I'm the one who made all these decisions. You shouldn't be blaming the monk. And so the family now feels horrified. The community, they feel so bad that they criticize and accuse this person of something so horrible. So they rush to the monk and they say, "Oh, we're so sorry. Like, how could we have done this? Can you forgive us? And can we take the baby back because the baby is our responsibility now?" And the monk's response is, "Oh, is that so? Okay." And he gives the baby back, right? And that story is an example of equanimity because throughout the entire moment, the monk is never disturbed, right? He's not angry. He's not seething with resentment, but he doesn't also feel vindicated and he doesn't feel joyful that he was exonerated. He doesn't feel like, yeah, see, you all were wrong and all this stuff, that I was right. None of that's there because he's free from all of that, just as a mountain range or a cloud or the ocean or the sun doesn't have these kinds of investments in what happens. It just does what it does. The monk just accepted anything that happened. So next to equanimity, meaning, remember, essentially the etymology is all things being equal, is also an acceptance of all things that happen and come to you. And for the Taoists, that's where true freedom comes in. That's where true peace comes from, right? And there's so many stories and tales about the kinds of ways that our expectations get in the way of what we think, right? There's a saying in Zhuangzi that says that, hey, take the most beautiful woman in the world, right? Imagine the most beautiful woman, right? Everyone thinks she's so great. People love her. When she goes and looks in the pond at the fish, she gets too close to the water, the fish run away. They think she's terrifying, right? And so for the Taoists, the question is, whose perspective is really correct? Why do we center the human perspective so much, right? Ultimately, Tao holds all perspectives. So the same way a fish or a squirrel sees you is just as valid in the ultimate scheme of things as your friends and family and things like that. And who are you to decide which one's more significant? And this is why there's this emphasis on equanimity. Because from the Tao doesn't only have a perspective, but in the context of the Tao, all things are equal. Nothing is better than the other. And so for the Taoists, the worst thing a human can do is seek happiness or avoid sadness. Because you're always going to block off a possibility for yourself. You're going to limit the reality with your own projection about what's good or what's bad. It's better to accept what comes to you. And so another thing comes with this. So remember, the first one's equanimity. The second thing is a sense of spontaneity, which is an evidence of your freedom, right? Things are just happening, things are just arising. And you can't necessarily always predict in advance what you're going to do. So there's lots of stories and tales of Taoist masters doing all kinds of controversial and strange things because they're so free, right? They're not really bothered by anything and they can act spontaneously in the world. That spontaneity is their true freedom, right? And that's not an easy way to live. It takes a lot of work and effort to be able to not be bothered by things enough and to feel free enough to do whatever spontaneously emerges within you, right? But that's different than, and I want to say this is different than just being reactionary, right? Because reactions, a lot of our reactions and things we repress are just that. They're still within the realm of what societal expectations are of us, and we might repress certain feelings or ideas. So when you're early in the stages, you might want to react, right? But that's often not react. That's often not real freedom, right? For example, your parents told you you couldn't eat sweets all your life growing up, and so in your normal life you eat pretty, healthily. But when you begin to break down the barriers, you might suddenly eat a bunch of sweets and that like that. But that's not the Taoist freedom to just like gobble up all the food and everything like that, because you still will be seeking a pleasure as opposed to letting it all go and just acting spontaneously from a non-attachment to the world. And this is where the Buddhism and Zen and Taoism really were able to connect, right? Is there's a non-attachment to things around you. That's your freedom, your true freedom. So to that end, with the spontaneity, there's a tie to another concept called wu wei, which essentially is non-doing action or non-doing doing. And the idea is that you act because you're acting spontaneously and in the flow of things, you use very minimal energy and you actually get the best response. So Taoism, as I mentioned, was one of the competitors with Confucian thought. And the idea was that if the leaders of society can go and live more in line with the Tao, then everything else will run better, right? If you notice nature, the stars, the planets, everything else functions in this order so beautifully, right? The sun always goes around the earth, right? The moon goes around the earth. Sorry, the earth goes around the sun, the moon goes around the earth. The trees have their flowers during the seasons and all these things. And yet we're the ones who have all this dysfunction. We're the ones who have all this crime and violence and despair and depression. Like I always tell people, you think a fish is depressed? You think a coral reef is super anxious, right? Obviously, there's feelings that come with like extreme stress, like a fire or an animal gonna eat you or things like that. But generally, most of the life forms are pretty at peace. They're pretty tranquil. When you go into the forest, you find tranquility. You don't find tension and anxiety, right? There's no place in the forest you find, for example, the level of tension that you find in what we call bad neighborhoods, right? You don't find that there. So that means that there's something that's a failure in us as humans that has led us to have all this chaos and dysfunction and disorganization in our lives. And so for Taoists, yeah, we should be less human and more like nature, right? And to compare this with with the video on King, right? The goal is not to have some type of ethical action in the world in that way. The goal is to let go of our expectations as much as possible and begin to go with the flow. And so, and then you can wu wei, which is non-doing doing. So A lot of people make comparisons with the Wu Wei to what's called the flow state. And with the flow state, think about it this way. Whenever you've had a really good connection with someone, or if you play sports, when you've had a really good, whether it's or video games, when you're having a really, really good game, you notice you're not really thinking a whole lot. Things are just flowing very well. Or when you connect with someone really well, things are just flowing very well, right? So there are many arguments that that flow state, living in that flow state continually, is the ultimate ideal Taoist state. That you work to live in that flow state more and more and more until that's all that you're living in. It's just you're just flowing, right? The same way you might feel when you're moving through a really good game, sports or video game, or you have a really great connection and it's just flowing, and you're able to act spontaneously and things work out. Many Taoists, especially some of the later ones, begin to say, yeah, like if you focus on building that, everything will work really well. So early in the Zhuangzi, there's a story of a butcher named Cook Ding, and he says he's able to use the same knife to cut animals for like 20 years straight. And in the story, they ask like, "How are you able to do that?" And he says, "Well, he said, when I first started, I would go through a knife every 6 months because I would just kind of scrape and do all these things, and I'll have to get a new knife. But then eventually, I was able to get smoother, right? And I could keep my knife longer." He says, now when I look at it, I just see the joints. I don't even really see anything else. It's just a very intuitive flow motion. And because of that, I'm able to perfectly carve through any type of animal, and I'm able to keep the same knife for 20 years straight, right? Without it dulling. And that level of mastery, the knife, is symbolic of the human body. Being that when you're able to flow, one, you maintain the equanimity, a certain type of tranquility, a peace of sorts, inner rest or calm. But two, and this is where Taoism, different Taoist schools of thought had different perspectives, but the idea is you also could become immortal, right? If you only lived in this flow state and cultivated and had the minimal action, your life, you would enlong your life. The highest would say, the highest peak of that could be literal immortality. But at the very least, you could um, you could live longer, right? And also be more effective. So what if instead of trying to follow traditions or customs or norms or rules or morality, you just flowed and trusted that just as the sun does what it's supposed to do, you'll do what you're supposed to do when you act in alignment with the Tao. So that's the second part, which is a spontaneity, which is tied to Wu Wei, which means non-doing, doing, or effortless action. And it's now connected to, especially in Western philosophy, I mean, in science, to the flow state, which is when you're just flowing, right? It's often talked about in athletes and other people, lots of people that can enter into a flow state. And the idea being that you can continually live in that state, but only once you let go of your expectations. Because you notice you're not thinking a lot when you're flowing. When things are going really, the better things are, the less you're thinking, right? So, what if you start thinking generally about the life you're living? That's kind of what the Taoists ask us to do. And there comes an incredible peace and an effectiveness that they argue, especially later, in managing and helping things happen around us. So, with that background, we can return to the ideal person from the Taoist, which is, as we said, someone who doesn't seek pleasure, doesn't try to avoid pain, accepts all that comes, and is truly free. Free to defy other people's expectations. Think about how much other people's thoughts about you limit what you can do or what you can't do. What if you let all that go, right? What if you let go of customs and traditions and norms and just acted from whatever genuinely arose within you? Well, they would argue that you might lose what we call humanity in the classic sense of certain customs and rituals and norms and values and traditions, but you'll gain your true sense of self, which is a piece, a drop of a cosmic ocean, right? A piece of something that's undefinable but can hold any kind of definition. The Tao, right? The ultimate thing that exists but also doesn't exist because it's able to include anything that ceased to exist. All things that exist and all things that cease to exist occur within the Tao, the ultimate way things are. And as I said, for the Taoists, there's no greater freedom. There's no greater gift that you can give to the world than from when they interact with you, for you to be a window into the mysterious beyond. Until we talk again.